On the morning of January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall walked the tail race of a sawmill on the South Fork of the American River and noticed something catching the light in the gravel. He was building the mill for a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter, and the land around it belonged, in the way land belonged to anyone in California that winter, to the Nisenan people who had lived along that stretch of river for longer than anyone could say. Marshall picked the flakes out of the water, weighed them on a kitchen scale, tested them with a hammer, and with vinegar borrowed from the mill's cook, and within a year the name of that river would be known on 4 continents. Sutter tried, briefly and without success, to keep the discovery quiet, worried correctly that it would bring more people onto his land than he could ever control. But the story of what happened next does not stay at Sutter's mill. It moves south, down through the Sierra foothills, into a stretch of country drained by 5 rivers that carried names the miners would spend the next decade learning to pronounce: the Mokelumne, the Calaveras, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, the Merced. This was Miwok country, and had been for thousands of years before anyone panned a single ounce of color out of it. The people who lived along those rivers called themselves, in their own language, simply the people. Miwok is the word for it. Villages sat where the rivers widened into pools, where salmon ran in the fall, and where oak groves produced the acorns that formed the base of an entire economy. Granaries built of woven branches stood beside the houses, some of them holding a season's worth of food, and grinding hollows worn into streamside granite by generations of women processing acorn meal are still visible today in places like the Sierra foothills above the Stanislaus and the Tuolumne. The seasonal round moved with the water and the oaks. Fall brought the acorn harvest and the salmon runs together. Winter was spent in permanent riverside villages living off what had been stored, and spring and summer sent smaller groups higher into the mountains to gather bulbs, seeds, and game. Before gold was ever found, the population of the Plains and Sierra Miwok has been estimated at somewhere between 9,000 and nearly 18,000 people, spread across dozens of independent village communities along the rivers and the oak-studded foothill country between them. That population had already been struck once before anyone found gold. In 1833, a malaria epidemic that had traveled south along trapping routes from the Columbia River reached the Central Valley and moved up the Sacramento and San Joaquin systems into the rivers the Miwok called home. At least 20,000 native people across the valley, Miwok, Yokuts, Wintun, and Maidu among them, died within that single year, and travelers who passed through afterward described villages standing empty along the water, the people who had lived in them gone within weeks. One Miwok leader from this earlier period is remembered by name specifically because a river now carries it. Estanislao, who had led resistance against the mission system out of Mission San Jose in the 1820s before eventually returning there and teaching until his death in 1838, gave his name, in its Spanish form, to a river the Miwok had called something else entirely. The Rio Lacrisimas became the Stanislaus. By the time gold was found at Sutter's Mill 15 years later, the river systems of Miwok country were already carrying the name of a man who had fought against one wave of colonization, on their way toward a war that would arrive with the next one. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What happened to those villages after 1848 happened with a speed that is difficult to overstate. Miners moving south from the American River found the same gravel, the same color, along every one of the 5 rivers that ran through Miwok land, and they found it fastest exactly where the villages already stood, because the people had built their homes on the same river bars and low terraces where the gold had been collecting for millennia. By some estimates, the statewide native population of California, which stood near 100,000 people before the rush began, had fallen to roughly 30,000 within a few years of the discovery. Among the Plains and Sierra Miwok specifically, population estimates that stood near 6,000 people in 1848 had, within a single generation, collapsed toward numbers small enough that entire village lineages simply ceased to exist. Disease moved ahead of the miners and behind them. Violence moved alongside them, and the rivers themselves, the ones that had fed those villages every autumn for as long as anyone's grandparents could remember, were being physically taken apart, boulder by boulder, sandbar by sandbar, in the search for what lay beneath them. The clearest single record of what that collision looked like on the ground comes from the Mariposa foothills, in the country between the Merced and the Fresno rivers, in the winter of 1850. A trader named James Savage had built a post there to deal with the southern Sierra Miwok and neighboring groups, offering goods for gold in an arrangement that quickly soured as miners pushed further into land the Ahwahneechee band, under a leader named Tenaya, considered their own. On the 17th of December that year, a force of native fighters attacked Savage's post and killed several of his men. The attack triggered what would become known as the Mariposa War, and California's governor authorized a volunteer force, the Mariposa Battalion, to move into the mountains that winter and force the resisting bands onto reservation land. What the battalion's own participants recorded about that campaign is not disputed history. A physician riding with the expedition, Lafayette Bunnell, kept a detailed account of what they did. Villages were burned, stored food, the Acorn granaries that would have carried families through the winter was destroyed deliberately and systematically, a tactic understood at the time to be as effective as any weapon. In March of 1851, the battalion pushed into a valley that Tenaya's people called Ahwahneechee, becoming the first non-native party to enter it, and Bunnell is credited with giving it the name it carries today, Yosemite, a word that in the Miwok language did not describe the valley at all, but referred to the fierce reputation of the band who lived there. Tenaya and his people evaded capture through the spring, retreating higher into the mountains, but the campaign continued. 2 of the chief's sons were killed in the course of it. On the 30th of May, 1851, Tenaya surrendered at the lake that now bears his name, and his people were marched down out of the mountains to the newly established Fresno River Indian Reservation. The reservation that awaited them was not a sanctuary. It sat on hot, low-lying valley ground, a landscape entirely unlike the granite and pine country the Ahwahneechee had lived in for generations, and it depended for its food supply on federal provisions that arrived late, arrived short, or did not arrive at all. Within a year, by most accounts, Tenaya and a portion of his band had left the reservation and returned to the high country around Yosemite Valley, choosing the risk of renewed conflict with settlers over the certainty of hunger on land that had never belonged to them. The battalion's own campaign records and Bunnell's later published account agree on this much, that the promise of protection and provision made to the Ahwahneechee at their surrender was not kept in any form the people who received it would have recognized as a promise honored. While that campaign was unfolding in the southern foothills, a separate and in some ways more consequential process was taking place at the negotiating table. Between March of 1851 and January of 1852, 3 federal commissioners, George Barbour, Reddick McKee, and Oliver Wozencraft, traveled across California, negotiating a series of 18 treaties with what were recorded as 119 tribes and bands, Miwok communities among them. The terms asked native people to give up their claim to the gold country entirely in exchange for guaranteed reservation lands, tools, clothing, and provisions. Leaders signed. Marks were made on documents in council grounds up and down the state, including in the foothill country the Miwok had occupied for generations. And then, on the 8th of July, 1852, the United States Senate met in a closed executive session and rejected all 18 treaties outright. It did not stop there. The Senate ordered every document connected to the negotiations sealed under an injunction of secrecy, a formal order that the treaties not be disclosed. That injunction was not lifted until the 18th of January 1905, more than 50 years later. For half a century, the people who had signed those agreements, and their children, and in many cases their grandchildren, had no way of knowing that the promises made to them had been rejected the same year they were made. The reservation lands promised in exchange for the gold country were never granted. The gold country was never returned. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The rivers themselves were changing in ways that had nothing to do with treaties or battalions, and everything to do with the technology miners brought to bear on the land. Early placer mining, panning, and simple sluicing gave way within a few years to something far more destructive. In 1853, a miner named Edward Mattison developed a technique near a site called Blue Tent in Nevada County that used high-pressure water cannons, called monitors, to blast entire hillsides apart and wash the resulting gravel through sluices to extract the gold. Hydraulic mining, as it came to be called, spread rapidly through the Sierra foothills over the following 3 decades. Monitors, iron nozzles fed by miles of flume and canal, could throw a jet of water hard enough to kill a man standing in front of it, and were pointed instead at entire hillsides, stripping them down to bedrock in a matter of seasons. Between the 1850s and the 1880s, more than 1.5 billion cubic yards of gravel were processed by hydraulic operations across the northern Sierra Nevada region alone, a volume of earth movement that dwarfed anything the region's rivers had produced through natural erosion across thousands of years. The rivers that Miwok villages had depended on for salmon, for water, for the very geography of daily life, were buried under what miners themselves called slickens, the sterile grey sediment that hydraulic mining sent downstream by the ton, choking channels and raising riverbeds high enough to flood towns that had stood safely above the waterline for generations. Mercury, used to bind with fine gold particles during processing, was lost into those same waterways in staggering quantities. Later estimates place the mercury lost during hydraulic mining across California at roughly 6,000 tons, with several thousand more lost in hard rock operations, much of it settling into the same river systems the Miwok had fished for thousands of years. That mercury did not stay buried. It continues, according to modern geological surveys, to move slowly downstream through Sierra sediment even now, a century and a half after the mining that released it. Salmon runs that had defined the autumn calendar for entire communities collapsed under the combined weight of blocked channels, buried gravel beds, and poisoned water, and the loss reached communities far beyond the foothills themselves, since the same rivers that ran past Miwok villages continued on to feed the Sacramento and San Joaquin systems that other native nations depended on downstream. It took until 1884 for the damage to reach a courtroom in a form the state could no longer ignore, and even then it was not native communities who brought the case. Farmers downstream in the Central Valley, whose fields were being buried under mining debris and whose towns were flooding with increasing severity, sued the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. On the 7th of January 1884, Judge Lorenzo Sawyer issued a ruling, later known simply as the Sawyer Decision, permanently barring large-scale hydraulic mining operations from discharging debris into the rivers of the Sierra Nevada. It effectively ended the practice across the region. The decision is remembered today as one of the earliest environmental rulings in American law. It came more than 3 decades after gold was first found on the American River, 3 decades during which the rivers running through Miwok territory had already been reshaped, buried, and poisoned beyond anything the people who lived along them for millennia could have anticipated when Marshall first bent down to look at what was glittering in that tail race. What survived those 3 decades did not survive in government records which were sealed, or in mining company ledgers which counted gravel and gold but not villages. It survived in the memory of the people themselves, and it was a small number of specific, named individuals working with early ethnographers who managed to carry that memory into a form the wider world could eventually read. Beginning in the early 1900s, a naturalist and ethnographer named C. Hart Merriam, who had earlier headed the federal government's Bureau of Biological Survey, spent parts of 2 decades traveling through the Sierra foothills, recording origin stories, place names, and oral traditions directly from Miwok elders. He worked patiently, often returning to the same families across multiple visits, sitting with elders in the roundhouses where the old stories were traditionally told after the first winter rains, and he published much of what he gathered in 1910 as a collection titled The Dawn of the World. Around the same period, another ethnographer, Edward Gifford, working under the University of California, gathered a separate body of Miwok narrative material, published in 1917 as Miwok Myths. Neither collection was primarily concerned with the gold rush itself. What they preserved instead was something older and in some ways more fragile: the origin accounts, the river geography, and the seasonal knowledge that had structured Miwok life along the Mokelumne, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and the Merced, before any of those rivers had a foreign name attached to them. The elders Merriam and Gifford sat with had themselves lived through the collapse of that world, through the malaria years, through the war in the Mariposa foothills, through the decades when the rivers changed color with tailings. Those pages are, in the most literal sense, testimony taken from survivors, recorded by name, in their own words as closely as translation could manage. The population numbers that follow that testimony into the 20th century are stark by any standard. Where estimates for the Plains and Sierra Miwok before 1848 ran into the thousands, by 1880, some counts placed surviving numbers in the low hundreds, a collapse of more than 90% within little more than a single generation. By 1910, when Merriam's collection was published, the recorded population had recovered only slightly, numbering in the low hundreds still. Today, Miwok descendants are estimated at roughly 3,500 people, organized among several federally recognized tribes and rancherias across central California, actively engaged in preserving language, place names, and the ceremonial knowledge that elders like the ones Merriam and Gifford interviewed chose, at real cost to themselves, to pass on. The map itself changed alongside the population. Mining camps went up along the same rivers where Miwok villages had stood, and most of those camps took names that had nothing to do with the people whose land they occupied. Jamestown, Angels Camp, Chinese Camp, Jackson, Volcano, names drawn from prospectors, investors, and the countries and provinces miners had come from, not from the Miwok words that had described those same stretches of river for centuries before. A handful of Miwok place names did survive the transition, absorbed into county names and river names with their meanings altered or forgotten by the people using them daily, Tuolumne among them, its original meaning still debated by linguists today. Most did not survive at all, and it is this quieter erasure, unremarked in any court record or Senate injunction, that Merriam and Gifford's fieldwork worked hardest to recover, asking elders directly what a given bend in the river, a given hill, a given spring, had actually been called before English took over the task of naming it. There is a granite outcrop above the Stanislaus River today, one of many such sites scattered through the foothills, where the grinding hollows worn by generations of women processing acorns are still visible in the rock, filled now with rainwater and pine needles instead of meal. A short distance downstream, the riverbed still carries the scars of the dredging and hydraulic work that reshaped it 170 years ago, gravel piles and altered channels that geologists can still map today. Between those two marks in the stone and the water sits the entire arc of what happened here. A carpenter looked down into a tail race on a January morning in 1848, and within 3.5 decades the rivers that had defined Miwok life for thousands of years had been legally promised back to their people in writing, secretly denied by the same government that made the promise, and physically buried under a debris field that took a federal court ruling to finally stop. The gold that was taken out of those rivers is scattered now through vaults and jewelry and museum collections around the world, most of it long separated from any record of which riverbed it came from. What the rivers themselves lost is harder to inventory, and what the people who lived beside them lost is harder still to measure in any single figure a historian could put on a page. But it did not disappear. It was carried forward instead by elders who sat for interviews in their final years, knowing what would be lost if they did not, by descendants who kept speaking the language in the households where it was still safe to speak it, and by researchers willing to write down, exactly as it was told to them, what a river had been called before anyone panned a single flake of gold out of it. It was written down, by name, by people who were there, and it is still being read. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.